Blessed day, everyone. This is to present to you my research entitled Defending Women Journalists in the Philippines from Threats and Intimidations. I am Abigail Gomez from Cavite State University, Imus campus. Despite the studies on defending journalism and coming up with various practices to protect journalists, still the Philippines ranked as the third worst country in impunity versus the journalists in the 2016 Global Impunity Index released by the Committee to Protect Journalists. In 2017, 2018, 2019, it ranked fifth in the same impunity index. Then the country ranked seventh and was still consistently part of the top 10 rankings for the past 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022. This shows that the number of threats against journalists remains significant. This study deals with quantitative approaches to determine the threats and intimidations that selected women journalists face and provide course of actions which media companies may use to at least lower the rankings of the country in the impunity index. The journalism profession is a very risky job, whether in news, investigative, feature, or editorial. The fact that the words being published or broadcasted reach many people means that many might be positively or negatively affected with the message being brought to them. Women play a vital role in the society and their participation in the media varies in unimaginable ways at the turn of the millennium. Across Asia, there has been a progressive and positive growth in the numbers of women in newsrooms working as freelancers, editors, bloggers, writers, and people of influence. Likewise, women in politics and the media often face attacks and harassment with the goal of silencing them. This violence is a significant obstacle to inclusive democracies, hindering women's participation. This issue has worsened during the COVID-19 pandemic with increased incidents of gender-based violence in both public and private spheres. This further indicates that men are likely to dominate the profession much more than women. Therefore, women are more likely to be attacked or assaulted than their male counterparts. For women journalists and media workers, gender based attacks continue to be a persistent part of the daily routine of women journalists. Despite press freedom restoration, the Committee to Protect Journalists has a database which discloses the number of journalists killed in the Philippines from 1992 up to 2023. The data shows that for these years, there were 158 reported killings and 2 cases of imprisonment. Among these incidents, 9 were female journalists who lost their lives and 1 woman journalist was imprisoned. This was according to the Committee to Protect Journalists data last 2023. With the alarming number of journalist killings, attacks, and unsolved cases, the United Nations introduced the UN Plan of Action for the Safety of Journalists with focus on addressing the critical problem of impunity. Surprisingly, this initiative remains relatively unfamiliar to Filipino journalists, journalism educators, and students in the Philippines. The Asian Institute of Journalism and Communication and International Media Support published the Philippine Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists. With a consistent ranking in the recent years, Philippines maintaining its seventh position in the Global Impunity Index for 2020, 2021, and 2022, the threat against Filipino journalists remains significant and more commonly, only the killings, missing, and imprisoned were reported in an international scale. This study deems that it is equally important to identify the threats and intimidations that women journalists experienced and come up with actions that would mitigate such acts. This descriptive study sought to identify the threats and intimidations experienced by the women journalists, determine how often and from whom do they receive such threats and intimidations, and evaluate, develop preventive, corrective, and developmental actions for defending women journalists in the Philippines. The researcher employed descriptive research methods to analyze data collected from women journalists. Snowball sampling technique was utilized involving referrals to expand the sample. The study initially started with 7 targeted participants, each of whom subsequently referred additional women journalists they knew from various media organizations in the country. Now, to ensure ethical considerations were being addressed, the researcher prioritized the privacy and confidentiality of the participants. Names and media organizations where they belong were not disclosed in the study to safeguard their identities and prevent potential harm. To facilitate data collection, a survey questionnaire was adapted from Civic Action Resources, focusing on the working conditions of women journalists in Pakistan. It was modified to align with the experiences of women journalists in the Philippines. For data analysis, the researcher employed descriptive statistics, including frequency counting, percentage, rankings to ensure accurate results. Additionally, a Likert scale method was used to gauge the participants' opinions on the proposed mechanisms. We go with the results. 37 women journalists participated in this study, with majority or 34 hailing from Luzon, 2 from Visayas, and 1 from Mindanao. Approximately half of the participants fell within the age range of 40 to 49 years old. 28 were affiliated with print media for more than 15 years, while 9 worked for online news platforms for less than 10 years. Flash on screen is that 54.05% of the participants experience blackmailing from sources. This type of intimidation and threat ranked as number one in this study. Sources usually include tipsters, government officials, people involved in the news, witnesses, wire services individuals quoted, and other providers of news. This also includes being red tagged by the government. Likewise, data also reveals that 48.64% of women journalists receive threats of physical violence, abuse of power and authority, attempts to damage reputation and honor, and public humiliation or threats to humiliate are also being experienced by the women journalists. The high prevalence of blackmailing from sources and threats of physical violence highlights the urgent need for measures to protect women journalists in their interactions with their sources and in their workplace. Though this study reveals the form of harassments presented to women journalists were minimal compared to the population of participants, harassments are still existing. Sexual advances are still proliferating. Most of the harassments experienced are sexual favors in exchange of promotion and privileges, unwelcome, improper, or unnecessary gesture of sexual nature, and suggestive expression or lewd insinuation. All forms of sexual harassments are declared unlawful by the country. The Anti-Sexual Harassment Act of 1995 values the dignity of every individual regardless of gender. Although the prevalence of harassment is relatively low among the participants, the persistence of sexual advances and sexual favor in exchange for promotion is concerning. These behaviors must be condemned and addressed. The existence of unwelcome and improper gesture, suggestive expressions, and lewd insinuations highlight the importance of enforcing anti-sexual harassment laws to create a safer work environment. The other percentages, 21.62, 16.22, 10.81, are the other kinds of harassments being experienced by our participants. 54.05% of the women journalists experience threats and harassments from news sources. Even if the news sources are the top providers of threats and harassments, it is likewise alarming to see that 6 of them were threatened or harassed by their own employers. This result highlights a critical need for media organizations to establish safeguards and mechanisms to protect their journalists within their media company. Employers must take proactive measures to ensure a safe and respectful workplace for all employees. In order to defend the journalists from these kinds of threats, intimidations, and harassments, three types of actions or mechanisms were presented by the researcher to the women journalists. These are preventive actions, which can be done personally and inside the newsrooms before any conflict arises. Two, corrective actions, which are done immediately by the employers to solve cases and when the conflicts already arose, and developmental actions which have longer term effects and has a wider or national coverage or scope. For the preventive actions, placing local cybercrime division for journalists in the newsroom, providing bodyguards, cell phones and material support, and conducting trainings for self-defense are actions which are very much acceptable for women journalists. They are also the actions considered very feasible to be done in the newsroom or media company. Women journalists find preventive actions like providing training for safety and self defense, promoting gender equality in the newsroom, offering bodyguards and cell phones, and material support very acceptable and feasible. Implementing these measures can enhance the journalist's safety. Likewise, the positive response to placing local cybercrime division in newsrooms suggests that this approach could help combat online threats effectively. For corrective actions, creating an ethics investigation committee is the only corrective action which is very much acceptable for most women journalists who participated in this study. Moreover, the rest of the actions are acceptable and feasible. The high acceptability of creating an ethics investigation committee indicates that women journalists believe that this can be an effective means to address harassment and ethical violations. On a national scale, putting into law the formation of gender and development unit in the newsroom and media organizations garners the very much acceptable rating and very much feasible evaluation of the women journalists. The strong support for putting into law the formation of a gender and development unit in newsrooms and media organizations suggest a need for legal measures to ensure gender sensitivity and safety. Advocating for better legislation and initiating a national protection mechanism are also seen as feasible approaches to address the broader issues faced by women journalists. These implications indicate the urgency of addressing threats, harassment, and workplace safety for women journalists in the Philippines. Media organizations, government authorities, and industry stakeholders should take proactive steps to implement and recommend actions and create a safer and more inclusive environment for women journalists. When asked for recommendations, some of the statements of the journalists include proper implementation of the current law to defend not just women but all journalists who are experiencing injustices. We do already have the Presidential Task Force on Media Security, but it isn't enough to be the watchdog, especially if it can be selective. We can recommend higher penalty for those who will violate journalists' rights, in other words, and impunity. Then these are the remaining recommendations, not only protection from intimidation, threat, and harassment, but also protection from abuse being committed by employers on labor laws. Teach the state forces to respect and give fair judgment on women and journalists. Judgment on women journalists. Institute a national protection mechanism to address impunity for attacks against women journalists. There must be a safe, gender sensitive investigative procedures. In summary, this study reveals an urgent need for immediate action to protect women journalists in the Philippines. Alarming statistics, including threats, blackmail, and harassment, call for swift collaborative efforts among media organizations, government authorities, and industry stakeholders. Ensuring the safety and well being of women journalists from news sources and employers is paramount to preserving media integrity and fostering a more inclusive society. In addition, the top most recommended actions include providing training for the safety and self defense of women journalists, offering bodyguards, cell phones, and material support, establishing a local cybercrime division within newsrooms, creating an ethics investigation, revising and strengthening the Philippine Journalists Code of Ethics, and enacting legislation to establish gender and development units within the newsrooms. These findings present the urgency of addressing issues related to threats, harassment, and safety within the media industry in the Philippines. The proposed actions represent promising steps towards creating a safer, more equitable, and inclusive environment for women journalists. Thus, it is essential for media organizations, industry stakeholders, and policymakers to heed these conclusions and work collaboratively to ensure the protection and well being of women journalists, ultimately fortifying the integrity of journalism in the country. You may read my full paper at ijmapper.org. Once again, this is Abigail C. Gomez from Cavite State University, Imus campus, and I hope that you learned something from me today.